I didn't expect to end up lost in the middle of nowhere that night. All I'd wanted was to make it home in time for my sister's birthday dinner. But I was coming from work, and the main highway was blocked off because of an accident. The detour signs led me through back roads I wasn't familiar with, winding and dark. I thought I'd be fine. I had my GPS, a nearly full tank of gas, and it wasn't the first time I'd taken an unfamiliar route. But something about that night felt different. The darkness seemed heavier, the shadows on the trees lining the road longer. And as I drove deeper into the countryside, I noticed that my GPS signal was starting to flicker in and out. No problem, I told myself, laughing nervously. Just follow the signs. Except there were no signs anymore. It was past 10 p.m. now, and the roads were completely empty. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and my GPS was entirely useless. The map on my phone was just a gray blur. All I could see in front of me was a narrow, winding road cutting through a dense forest, with only my headlights lighting the way. Just keep driving, I told myself. You'll hit a main road soon enough. But the longer I drove, the more uneasy I felt. The road didn't seem to lead anywhere. It just kept twisting and turning, like it was going in circles. I felt like I'd passed the same trees over and over, but that didn't make any sense. How could I be lost on a single road? The road narrowed even more until it was just a strip of cracked pavement, barely wide enough for my car. I kept expecting it to open up, or at least to reach some kind of intersection, but nothing changed. That's when my headlights caught a glimpse of something on the side of the road, a strange worn sign that read Midnight Hollow. It looked ancient, the paint peeling and letters barely legible. I had never heard of Midnight Hollow, and I was sure it wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. But at that point, I didn't care. It had to lead somewhere, right? So I took the turn, hoping it would eventually get me back to the main road. As I continued down the narrow path, I noticed something strange. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches hanging low, almost like they were trying to reach out and touch the car. The leaves rustled in the wind, and every now and then, I'd hear a faint whisper, too soft to make out. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road grew bumpier, and I had to slow down to avoid the deep potholes that dotted the path. My headlights flickered a couple of times, which freaked me out even more. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me, but all I could see was darkness. And then I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was just barely visible in the beam of my headlights, a shadowy outline against the dark trees. It was tall, too tall to be human, and it seemed to be wrapped in a long cloak that blended into the night. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, even from a distance. I wanted to speed up, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But as I pressed down on the gas, my engine sputtered and died. No, 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 I whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The car wouldn't start. It was dead silent, except for my own panicked breathing. I looked up, and the figure was closer. It hadn't moved, at least, I hadn't seen it move. But somehow, it was now standing just a few feet away from my car, its cloak billowing in an invisible wind. I could see its eyes now, two pinpoints of light, cold and unblinking, staring right at me. I was paralyzed, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Then, without warning, the figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, like it was studying me. My skin crawled, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from that thing as I could. But how could I? My car was dead, and the nearest town was miles away. Just as I was about to try my phone again, the figure lifted one hand and pointed down the road. It was a long, bony finger, pale and twisted, and it seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I didn't understand. Was it telling me to go somewhere? Was it guiding me? The figure didn't speak, didn't move. It just stood there, pointing, its cold eyes fixed on me. With no other option, I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and got out of the car. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a fall night, and I could see my breath in the faint light of my flashlight. I glanced at the figure again, but it hadn't moved. It was still standing by the road, watching me, pointing. I turned and started walking in the direction it was pointing, my footsteps echoing in the silent night. The road was narrow, lined with thick trees that blocked out what little moonlight there was. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet, and every now and then, I thought I heard whispers, faint and distant, like they were coming from the trees. The path led me deeper into the forest, twisting and turning, with no end in sight. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself that I'd find a way out eventually, but the further I walked, the more lost I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches hanging low, brushing against my shoulders like cold fingers. And then I saw something up ahead, a light, faint and flickering, just barely visible through the trees. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was a house, or a cabin, or something that could help me get out of here. I quickened my pace, my flashlight bouncing as I made my way toward the light. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a house. It was a lantern, hanging from a twisted tree branch, swaying gently in the breeze. The light cast eerie shadows on the ground, and as I looked around, I saw that there were more lanterns, hanging from the trees, lining the path. The lanterns led me to a small clearing, where I saw an old abandoned cabin. It was barely standing, the roof sagging and the windows broken. But there was something about it that drew me in, like it was calling to me, inviting me inside. I hesitated, glancing back at the path, but the darkness seemed thicker now, like it was pressing in on me, pushing me toward the cabin. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my flashlight casting long shadows on the rotting wood. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dark, empty room. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mold and decay. I swept my flashlight around, taking in the broken furniture, the dusty floor, the shattered mirror on the wall. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There on the floor was a message, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, "You're not alone." I took a step back, my heart pounding. The cabin was silent, but I could feel something watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I wanted to leave, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. It was too soft to make out, but I could feel it, like a breath on the back of my neck. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the same figure from the road, its eyes glowing in the darkness, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its cold gaze fixed on me, unblinking. I took a step back, and my foot hit something, a book, lying on the floor, half covered in dust. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and flipped through the pages. They were filled with strange symbols, drawings of figures like the one standing in front of me, cloaked and watching. As I reached the last page, I saw a name written in bold letters, Midnight Hollow. And then beneath the name were two words that sent a chill down my spine: no escape. The figure stepped closer, and I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room was closing in around me, the walls seeming to twist and warp, the shadows growing darker, thicker, until I couldn't see anything at all. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice, low and whispering, filled my ears. "Welcome to Midnight Hollow. My name is Alex, and this story isn't easy for me to tell. In fact, it's one I've tried to forget, but somehow it keeps haunting me. This is the story of the night I got lost in the woods, alone, and almost completely swallowed by darkness. I had always loved the forest. Something about the quiet rustling of leaves, the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, and the smell of pine trees calmed me. This love for the forest led me to take solo trips. My friends thought it was strange, and my parents always worried, but I never saw the harm. That was until one autumn night changed everything. It was late October, and the leaves had turned shades of red, orange, and yellow. The temperature had dropped just enough to make the air crisp and cool. It felt like the perfect time for a weekend getaway, a solo camping trip to escape work and life for a while. I packed my gear, double-checked everything: tent, food, water, flashlight, and a map, and set out in my car. The forest I'd chosen this time was about a 2-hour drive from the city, a place I had read about online but never visited. Supposedly, it was beautiful, with deep woods, scenic trails, and quiet clearing. When I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already starting to set. I figured I had about an hour or so of daylight left, just enough time to hike a little way into the forest and set up camp. I grabbed my backpack, checked my phone for any last messages, and noticed the signal was weak. I shrugged it off, expecting no service this deep in the woods. The path started wide and well-marked, winding between tall trees and thick underbrush. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound around me, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The further I walked, though, the narrower and darker the trail became. The trees grew closer together, and soon I was walking in near darkness. I glanced at my watch. 30 minutes had passed since I'd left my car. I should have found a clearing by now, but there was nothing but trees and shadows all around. I told myself it was fine. I could find a spot to set up camp soon, and if not, I'd turn back. Just as I was about to stop, I saw a faint glow through the trees, a clearing finally. I pushed forward, and as I stepped into the open area, relief flooded over me. The clearing was small, but enough space for my tent and a small fire. I wasted no time setting up. Within minutes, my tent was pitched, and I'd gathered enough firewood to last through the night. As the night grew darker, I started a small fire and sat close to it, warming my hands. I ate a sandwich and looked up at the stars. They were bright and beautiful, scattered across the sky in patterns I'd never seen so clearly back in the city. I felt a sense of accomplishment and contentment, alone in nature, with nothing but the fire, the stars, and my thoughts. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound, a faint humming, like a low, steady chant coming from deep within the forest. At first I thought it might be the wind, but the sound was too controlled, too consistent. It seemed like it was coming closer, growing louder with every second. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" Silence. The humming stopped for a moment, and I felt a strange sense of dread. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, the natural sounds of the forest at night. A minute later, the humming began again, only this time, it sounded much closer. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my fire. My flashlight was in my hand, but I hesitated to turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, but the sound continued, haunting and relentless, as if something or someone was making its way toward me. "Hey, stop messing around," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I sat back down, trying to ignore the growing sense of fear twisting in my stomach. But then I saw it, a faint light moving through the trees in the distance. It was like a lantern or a flashlight, bobbing gently as it moved, getting closer with each second. The sight of the light sent a chill down my spine. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I'd seen no other cars at the trailhead, and the forest was supposed to be empty. But here it was, a light moving toward me. I felt paralyzed, unable to decide whether to stay by the fire or run. My instincts told me to leave, but I knew I couldn't navigate the dark forest without my compass or my bearings. So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off my fire and crouched low, hoping the darkness would hide me. The light continued to move, weaving through the trees until it was only a few yards away. I held my breath, my heart pounding as I watched it stop at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out the person holding it, but I saw the outline of a figure, tall and motionless, standing just beyond the light. "Hello?" I whispered, barely loud enough for even myself to hear. No answer. The figure stood there for what felt like hours, just watching, the light casting long shadows across the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I felt like prey, trapped by a predator that had me completely cornered. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and started to move away, the light fading into the darkness until it disappeared entirely. I let out a shaky breath, feeling relief wash over me, but that relief was short-lived. The humming began again, even louder this time. It seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the trees like a ghostly chant. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, threw my backpack over my shoulder, and started running back the way I'd come. The forest was pitch black, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the sound of the humming growing louder with every step. It was as if the entire forest was alive, chanting in unison, guiding me deeper into its grasp. I ran blindly, desperate to escape the sound, but the forest seemed endless. No matter how far I went, there was no sign of the trail or my car. My phone was dead, and my compass spun uselessly, refusing to settle in any direction. I was completely, utterly lost. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. It was impossible to tell. My legs were burning, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. The humming was everywhere now, filling the air like a haunting melody that I couldn't escape. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it again, the faint glow of a light through the trees. It was the same light from before, only this time it was closer, as if waiting for me. With no other choice, I followed it, hoping it would lead me out of the forest. I stumbled through the underbrush, my flashlight flickering as I moved closer. The light grew brighter, and soon I found myself standing in front of a small cabin. The cabin was old and decrepit, with broken windows and a door hanging off its hinges. The light was coming from inside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I knew I shouldn't go in, but something compelled me to step closer. As I entered the cabin, a wave of cold washed over me. The walls were lined with strange symbols, painted in a dark red that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Bones littered the floor, some animal, some not. I tried to back out, but as I turned, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced as I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The humming filled the room, louder than ever, almost deafening. I covered my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air growing thick and suffocating. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed with a faint otherworldly light, and its mouth twisted into a chilling grin. "Why did you come here?" it whispered, its voice barely audible over the hum. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a terror I'd never felt before. I got lost," I stammered, my voice shaking. The figure laughed, a hollow, empty sound that seemed to resonate through the room. "No one just gets lost here," it said. "They're brought here." I didn't understand, but I knew I had to leave. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the figure just watched, its grin growing wider with every second. "You can't leave," it whispered. "Not now, not ever." The lights in the cabin flickered, and the humming grew louder, almost unbearable. I felt my body weaken, my legs giving out as I collapsed to the floor. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching across the room, reaching for me. Just as I felt its cold grip on my shoulder, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground outside the cabin. The sun was rising, casting a warm light over the forest. I looked around, disoriented, but there was. My name is Ben Collins, and last October, I went through something so terrifying that even now I hesitate to speak of it. I was never one to believe in ghosts or spirits, at least, not until that night. But what I saw, and what happened to me, changed everything. It all started with a camping trip. My friends and I, eager for a break from work and school, had planned a weekend in the woods. The group consisted of 4 of us: Charlie, my closest friend since childhood; Ethan, the jokester who always kept things light; and Josh, the quiet one who, despite his reserved nature, was always up for an adventure. We'd camped before, but this time, we wanted something a bit different, something further out from our usual spot. On a map called Wood Hill Forest. It was a vast area, dense with trees and with a reputation for being incredibly isolated. That was part of its charm. We wanted to escape the world after all. So, we packed up our gear, and on a chilly October afternoon, we set off. The drive took us further and further from civilization. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, cell service had already faded out. Ethan joked about us becoming off-the-grid survivalists, but I could tell we were all feeling a bit uneasy. The road leading into the forest was narrow and barely maintained, winding between towering pine trees that blocked out most of the daylight. "All right, guys, this is it," Charlie said, parking the car. We unloaded our backpacks, sleeping bags, and enough food to last the weekend. As we walked into the forest, the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and a hush settled over us. The first few hours passed in good spirits. We found a spot beside a small stream, where we set up our tents and built a campfire. The air was cool and fresh, the smell of pine and damp leaves filling our lungs. We laughed, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories. The worries of the outside world felt far away, and for a while, everything was perfect. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in shadows, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out. The forest around us grew silent, too silent. I could no longer hear the rustling of leaves or the chirping of birds, only the crackling of our campfire. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? I asked, trying to laugh it off, but my voice sounded hollow. Ethan grinned. Ooh, maybe Bigfoot's out there watching us right now. Charlie rolled his eyes. Or it's just your imagination. But I noticed that Josh didn't laugh. He sat quietly, staring into the fire, his face pale. Around midnight, Charlie suggested we take a walk deeper into the woods. He'd heard there was an old abandoned cabin somewhere in the forest, and he thought it would be fun to try and find it. I was hesitant, but I didn't want to be the one to back out. We grabbed our flashlights and told Josh and Ethan to keep the fire. Don't get lost, Josh warned, his voice serious. Charlie and I laughed it off and headed into the trees. The path was barely visible, just a faint trail through the dense undergrowth. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches forming a twisted canopy above us that blocked out even the moonlight. Our flashlights cast narrow beams that barely cut through the darkness, and every few steps, I caught glimpses of shadows shifting between the trees. Maybe we should head back, I said after a while. We can look for that cabin in the morning. But Charlie shook his head. Just a bit further, we'll be fine. We kept moving, but the forest felt different now. The silence was oppressive, and I felt like we were walking in circles, though Charlie insisted we were on the right path. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we were being watched by eyes we couldn't see. Then a low, distant growl that sent chills down my spine. We stopped, our flashlights trembling in our hands. Did you hear that? I whispered. Charlie nodded, his face pale. Yeah, let's head back. But when we turned around, the path we'd been following had vanished. The forest around us looked different, unfamiliar. Trees that should have been behind us were gone, replaced by twisted trunks and thorny bushes. We just came this way, Charlie said, panic creeping into his voice. He shined his flashlight around, but every direction looked the same. Maybe we took a wrong turn, I suggested, trying to stay calm. Let's just keep walking, we'll find our way back. But as we walked, the forest seemed to change around us. The trees grew closer together, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and every now and then, I thought I heard faint whispers, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. Our flashlights began to flicker, casting weak, shaky beams that barely cut through the fog that had settled over the forest floor. My heart was racing, and I could tell by Charlie's face that he was just as scared as I was. Ben, he said in a low voice, I think we're not alone out here. We stopped, straining our ears for any sound, and that's when we heard it again, the growling, closer this time. It was low and guttural, like an animal, but somehow different. It sounded angry, hungry. Without a word, we broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks in our desperate attempt to escape. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but fear kept me moving. Every few steps, I could hear the crunch of leaves behind us, as if something was following, staying just out of sight. We finally stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing to the ground, gasping for air. The forest around us was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Did we lose it? I panted. Charlie didn't answer. He was staring off into the trees, his face pale. What is it? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. He didn't respond, just pointed at the edge of the clearing. There, standing between the trees, was a figure. It was tall, dark, and motionless, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It just stood there, watching. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Charlie's arm. "We have to go." But he didn't move, frozen in place. The figure took a step forward, and I felt a chill wash over me. It was getting closer, slowly, deliberately. Finally, Charlie snapped out of his trance, and we turned and ran back into the forest, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. The trees closed in around us, branches scratching our arms and faces as we stumbled through the darkness. After what felt like hours, we came to a stop, too exhausted to keep going. We leaned against a tree, trying to catch our breath, but the forest around us was silent, watching. "Where are we?" Charlie whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted. My flashlight had died, and Charlie's was flickering on its last bit of power. We were lost, alone, and something was out there, hunting us. Just then, we heard a voice, a soft melodic voice calling out from somewhere in the trees. It was a woman's voice, calm and inviting. "Come here," it whispered. "Come closer." We looked at each other, fear etched on our faces. The voice was gentle, almost comforting, but something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this place. It echoed around us, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Don't listen to it," I whispered to Charlie, grabbing his arm. But he was staring off into the trees, as if in a trance. "Charlie." I shook him, and he blinked, snapping out of it. "We have to go." But before we could move, the fog thickened, swirling around us in a dense cloud. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. The voice whispered again, but this time it sounded angry, almost like a hiss. We stumbled back, clutching each other as we tried to navigate through the fog. Every direction looked the same, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding us, as if the forest itself was alive, drawing us deeper into its embrace. Eventually, we stumbled into a small clearing, and there, in the center, was a cabin. It looked old and abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but it was shelter. We rushed inside, slamming the door behind us and collapsing to the floor, gasping for air. The cabin was silent, and for a moment I thought we were safe. But then I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps upstairs. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs slowly, deliberately. We backed into a corner, clutching each other, our hearts pounding. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway, its eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. It moved toward us, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The last thing I remember is those eyes, piercing and unrelenting, as the darkness closed in around us. My name is Lucas, and I still remember the night I got lost in those eerie, endless woods. I had decided to take a late-night walk in the forest. I had no idea what kind of danger waited for me there. The forest was only supposed to be a short hike, a place I knew pretty well. I'd been there many times during the day, but something about the night turned those familiar trails into something else entirely. It was early October, and the air was getting cooler. I set out with a flashlight in one hand and my phone in my pocket. The moon hung low and full, casting a strange light over everything, so I thought I'd be fine. The trail was empty and quiet. I could only hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional hoot of an owl. About 20 minutes in, I noticed a fog settling in. It crept up from the ground like it was alive, swirling around my legs and slowly thickening until I could barely see my feet. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just some chilly night fog, and kept walking. But then I heard it, a soft whisper that made me freeze. "Lucas." I spun around, pointing my flashlight into the mist, but saw nothing. Just trees, branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I told myself it was the wind, trying to keep my cool, and continued forward. The trail started looking unfamiliar, as if the trees had shifted in the dark, and I felt the first prickling of unease. I reached into my pocket for my phone to check my location, but saw the battery was at 5%. My hands shook as I tried to open the map app, only to have my phone die completely. No service, no map, nothing. "Great," I muttered to myself. I was stuck, and it felt like every path looked the same in the dark. That's when I realized I hadn't even seen a trail marker in ages. I turned back, hoping to retrace my steps, but the fog had thickened even more. I squinted, trying to make out familiar shapes in the trees, but everything looked wrong. It was as if the forest had changed completely since I'd first entered it. Panic started to bubble up inside me. "Stay calm, Lucas," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel someone, or something, watching me. The footsteps got louder, coming closer. I forced myself to move, quickening my pace, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The forest around me seemed to breathe. Branches creaked, shadows moved, and that thick, cold fog wrapped tighter around me like a smothering blanket. I kept walking, my flashlight flickering, casting faint, distorted shadows on the trees. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something darting between the trunks. Something dark, almost human in shape, but not quite. I began to hear that whisper again, clearer now. "Lucas, Lucas." It sounded like my own voice, echoing back to me from somewhere deep in the trees, but that was impossible. I hadn't said anything. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the wind, but the voice continued. "Lucas, come this way." I felt a shiver race down my spine as I realized the voice was coming from all around me, echoing off the trees, bouncing back in strange, twisted tones. I started running, desperate to escape the whispers. My breath came in gasps and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. I slowed down, catching my breath, and scanned my surroundings. There was only silence now, deep, thick silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I pointed my flashlight around and noticed an old, run-down cabin a few yards away, half hidden by the trees. Part of me knew I should stay away, but my exhausted mind latched onto the idea of shelter. I stumbled towards it, hoping I could hide there until morning, but the cabin was in even worse shape up close. The wooden boards were rotten, the windows were cracked, and the door hung open like a gaping mouth. Inside, it was dark, but my flashlight gave me enough light to make out the dusty furniture and the decaying walls. I sat on a broken chair, breathing heavily, trying to calm my nerves, but the silence was short-lived. The footsteps were back. They were louder this time, echoing in the tiny cabin. I backed away, my heart racing, and watched as a shadow passed by the window. The figure stopped, standing just outside, and I saw the faint outline of a face, pale and expressionless, staring in at me. I froze, afraid to make a sound. The face stared for what felt like hours, then slowly moved away from the window, but just when I thought it was gone, I heard a soft tapping on the door, followed by a voice, my voice, calling from the other side. "Lucas, let me in." I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling a scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The tapping continued, steady and relentless, until I thought I would go mad. "Lucas, open the door." The voice was growing impatient, almost angry now. I glanced around the cabin, desperate for a way out, but there was only one window on the opposite wall. Gathering all the courage I could, I bolted towards it, throwing myself through the fragile glass. It shattered around me, and I landed hard on the ground outside, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, blood running from cuts on my hands and arms, and ran back into the forest. The whispers and footsteps followed me, growing louder with each step. I didn't know if I was heading in the right direction or if I was running deeper into the woods, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled out of the forest and onto the empty road that led back to town. I could see the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, and I ran towards them, never looking back. When I reached the lights, I collapsed, gasping for air, safe at last. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that voice, my own voice, whispering to me from the dark woods,